So we'll go ahead and get started, and just for everyone, feel free to drop Q&A in the chat as we go. We're going to leave some time at the end for an open discussion, but we're going to walk through a set of moderated questions to begin. So can you please both just introduce the major goals of your current work, and how is data being used in your current roles to achieve those goals?
Sure. So I can start and then I'll pass it over to Kurt. But as the acting chief sustainability officer, I'm responsible for ultimately hitting net zero emissions for our operation by 2050, net zero carbon emission. That includes several subsets of goals like 100% clean energy by 2030, 100% acquisitions of electric vehicles by 2027. And there's a lot of other things under there that we have to track. And obviously, if we're going to make a goal like hit net zero, we need to understand how can we track that. And so Kurt has been working on that with us. And so I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other things that are really critical include energy consumption, the quality of our power around the world, because that means that our equipment could fail if the power quality is bad. There's also, air quality when we're looking at how can we protect the personnel that serve around the world and their family if we don't have the data in hand for them to make real-time decisions. So the data is critical, and it varies from specific actions that we can take day to day, and then long-term strategic planning of how do we hit net zero, how do we keep our personnel safe, and then how do we leverage all the work that we're doing to improve the situation for our international partners as well. But I think one of the really exciting things as we look for net zero emissions is creating a carbon footprint. So I'll turn it to Kurt, who worked on that when he was here as a Jefferson Science Fellow.
Thanks, Caroline. So I'll preface, because you heard the two titles, that most of my comments today will be from my role as Senior Sustainability Advisor at the U.S. Department of State. And in that capacity, I've engaged on a number of climate change related projects, as Caroline just mentioned. And in particular, my work looks a lot at the sort of interdependencies between our operations for the State Department and climate change. There's a lot of upside to that. Within that work, there are at least three goals that I would identify. The first one, as Caroline alluded to, is simply understanding the current state of our greenhouse gas emissions across this rather large portfolio of locations, and within those locations, then sort of detailed operations that come about from getting the work done that the State Department does. So we have tens of thousands of buildings, as an example, many thousands of vehicles. And each of these contributes to that greenhouse gas emission profile. So that first step and first goal was really to move the department forward to understand what is our current emission profile look like, so that we can begin to assess that either across the entire enterprise or at the specific locations, 250 plus locations around the world where embassies and consulates are at. The second goal is, as we better understand the emissions, then we're in a better position to do something about them. To Caroline's point, to achieve net zero is great to hear, but there are practical implementation challenges to getting there, as any institution that is targeting those ambitions knows. And so a second goal is to begin to mitigate the emissions within the department using certainly department-wide strategies, but with the sensitivity that many of them are going to have to be locally tailored. The circumstances at each of our host nations, and certainly even within those nations at specific cities or regions, are different. in a lot of ways. So we need to be agile and adaptable to the sort of range of constraints and conditions. The third goal I'll mention is one I think that the State Department should be really proud of, which is once we begin to set things in motion, sharing our work with others, right? Can be certainly the other agencies across the federal government back in the States, or our local partners in the host countries, share what we are doing so that hopefully it can be an aspirational model of smart technology, smart investment to try to drive down these emissions.
That's really exciting to hear. And those are some really big goals. And you've kind of introduced this concept of many of these goals rely on data as a metric and as a means. So maybe we'll just address this next question more broadly, but why do you feel it's important to use data to solve global environmental challenges?
For us, and I think both for us as the State Department and then as the wider community on Earth, we have to use data because we have limited time and limited resources to get this done. So within the State Department context, we don't have a ton of resources and funding and staff time. And so we have to ruthlessly prioritize. So when I look at the data, what is going to be the biggest bang for the buck in terms of reducing emissions? And so when we looked at the initial work that Kurt did for us, it was clear that obtaining clean energy is one of the fastest ways that we can reduce our emission. We have a lot of work to do for scope 3, which includes supply chain and travel and shipping. But when it comes to scope 1 and 2, what we can actually do with the resources we have now is procure clean energy on our facilities and offsite. And this is a great way for us to also partner with the host government, with local partners in these cities and countries that we operate in, because they will want clean energy too. Most people do. And most of these countries have ambitious climate goals as well that they need to be looking at clean energy for too. So that ruthless prioritization is key, because if we're going to solve these global environmental issues, we need to be prioritizing. And I would say that's the same for the world. We just have limited time. We got to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius or keep it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we need to do the biggest actions first. So that's why I think it's really important to use data. The other reason is, and I think all of you in your careers will find this, data can help convince stakeholders to work with you. So if you're applying for funding for your research projects, or trying to convince a committee to support your portfolio, data can help tell that story. And it's not just data for data's sake, but really what will resonate with my stakeholders. So something that I think of one of the data projects that we've been working on is called Energy Cap. And before we started this program, we didn't have any way of tracking energy consumption or costs around the world. We had a smart metering program called MeterNet, which is at 100 of our sites overseas, but it's not tracking the cost. It's actually tracking the specific consumption data. It's a sensor on our electricity grid. But so now we have this software that uses optical character recognition to scan the bills and put it into a database. Through that effort, we found that we have bills in 77 languages. We have 1,345 different rate schedules, which is how you're charged for the energy that you consume. And that's a lot. That's really complex. The other thing we found is that our bills come in on a range of frequencies. So we have bills that come in every 2 weeks. We have bills that come in every couple of years. So, when you're thinking about data science and how to track these things, we have to use some logic to say, okay, different posts have different frequency of bills. So how do we track to make sure that we actually have all the data that we need, or that they have? So that's that's something that is really important for how we think about prioritization, and how we think about global problem solving. It's really complex, as Kurt said, but it's not. It is doable, and that's something that I think is really important too. The data can help you convince people that a problem is solvable. We have a lot of people who are really concerned about climate change, as they should be. It's an existential problem, but I think a lot of it is solvable. We just need to show people that there are things to do. So that's what I would say is really, really important. Kurt, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I will add a few thoughts around why data is important to solving these challenges. My comments are certainly applicable across the State Department. Again, it's truly a global enterprise, right? With presence in just about every country, 75,000 employees. It's a complex organization, a large organization, sure. But my comments, I think, also apply to the fact that these global challenges inherently require collaborations around the world. And so I'll mention three thoughts here in terms of the importance of data. One, from this global context, I think it's absolutely critical to use a shared language across all this diversity. Caroline mentioned, just for our utilities, 70 plus languages on the utility bills. It's even more than that in terms of who is either working on or affected by climate change or other sustainability issues. And so data, mathematics, those are shared languages that the engineer in me hopes provides a basis for, if it may be a starting point to more rationally examine and describe the current state of the environment. The second observation I would add here is, some wiser people than me have commented how we get one experiment with our planet. It's the one that we're running, right? And it's moving forward as this global integrated experiment. So the second important reason to have data is that it is an absolutely important prerequisite to driving forecasting models for various global environmental problems. And the modeling becomes really important to be able to run what-if scenarios, because we don't get that luxury on the experiment, right? We have to run those in a digital sort of experiment in a model, so that we can look at what are the consequences of certain actions, certain interventions. And then the last point I would make in terms of the importance of data is it's kind of a sort of a meta comment, and it's really good to see groups like yours, because I think that data provides this critical role for the international collaborations among nations. And those happen in a lot of different ways, certainly among governments, but across our national labs and across the universities and across researchers, whether it be, putting up global monitoring initiatives or international conferences, right? Data is often that kind of that shared impetus to work together so we better understand things, and then be able to report out what are we learning. And I think anytime we can share across international boundaries, our chances for succeeding in solving these huge problems improves.
Well, thank you. And you've both added some really, interesting points. Prioritizing effective solutions, stakeholder engagement, and kind of leading nicely into the next question, but the importance of international collaborations and aligning goals and aligning ways to achieve those goals. So for the next question, from a diplomacy perspective, how are international partnerships being leveraged or created to collect data and use these data to identify climate and sustainability solutions?
Yeah, it's a very fun time to be in this space because so many countries are facing the same issues that we're facing. So there was an executive order that was signed focused on climate risk and resilience for federal assets. For us, as Kurt mentioned, we have facilities and operations in almost every country around the world, over 270 cities. And so climate risks to us is real. We've had flooding in our embassies that have disrupted operation, even here in the United States, in Charleston, South Carolina. We've had drought, we've had sort of every climate risk that you can imagine. We're facing it now. And so we have a real existential question ourselves of, where are we going to put our facilities? How are we going to protect our operation? So we can't help support US citizens around the world if we can't even sustain our operations. We also can't support our diplomatic goals if we can't be in country because there's no energy, because the hydroelectric plant has shut down because there's no water. So for us, climate risks are real, and there's a lot of data that we need to make those decisions of, should we be in this parcel of land long term? Should we think about doing a hydrogen backup rather than a diesel backup, because there's no way to bring diesel to our embassy, or that one road that brings diesel in is going to be flooded routinely in the next 5 years. That data exists really well for the United States. We have fantastic science agencies that are doing really granular level modeling and forecasting, like Kurt mentioned, and it exists less so around the world. So for our portfolio, we've been working with NOAA and NASA and USGS and all these agencies that have science portfolios to see how we can leverage what we've done domestically and do it overseas. This data is really important for our international partners because they're facing the same problem. Some cities are looking at moving the whole city because they're going to be underwater. And so the more that we can share this data, not only internally across the government, but with other governments, with city governments, with other foreign ministries, the better. So we're looking at, how can we share this data that we have, and how can people give us data? Kurt and I have been serving on a network of sustainable foreign ministries, and it's foreign ministries like the State Department looking at their embassies around the world and thinking the same exact question. So we're looking at, how can we share data across the government for that? I would say another thing that is really salient is the air quality monitoring program, because we have air quality monitors in 79 cities around the world. These are reference grade monitors. We're using the 4+ decades of expertise from the EPA and putting these reference grade monitors in these locations that don't have ground-based data. There are 300 million people that are impacted by this data. They can use this data now to make daily decisions. And we found the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences published a paper recently that found that these monitors, just having the monitors, bent the curve downward on pollution emitted. And so that is something that we're really proud of. It was not the original intent of the program. The original intent was to protect our personnel and their families with real data so that they could decide, oh, maybe I'm not going out for recess right now, or maybe I'm going to cancel this diplomatic event that's going to be outside, or I'll bring it inside, or I'll run my room air cleaners on high. But we wanted to make that data public because we believe in open data. We don't want to have data that could impact somebody else in a positive way and not share it. So that data has really led to a platform for international engagement. I remember going into a mayor's office in a country and bringing a little low-cost sensor, not the reference grade monitor, but a little low-cost sensor. And the pollution in his office was 100 micrograms per cubic meters squared, which is very high. It's not very good. That means that there is no kind of barrier between the outdoor air and the indoor air. The outdoor air was terrible. So me bringing that in, he looked immediately at his health minister and was like, we got to do something. And that just opened this collaboration wide open. I could have sat there all day talking until I was blue in the face about data, but showing him on this little sensor really opened that conversation. I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Yeah. Yeah, 100 micrograms per cubic meter. It's probably not the office air you want. Let me offer a very specific example, sort of multi-stakeholder kind of concerns around data. And so I alluded to or mentioned the greenhouse gas emissions work that I've been a part of. Again, the goal is to try to understand the emissions around our global operations at the State Department. And so, it's clear that as data sort of flows from its point of origin to sort of downstream uses, you can start to think of data as having its own kind of supply chain, if you will. And there are stakeholders at various steps along the way. On top of that, there's this additional complexity of why does the data exist in the first place? And are we using it for its original intent or some opportunistic application, if you will? And in the greenhouse gas emissions work, we're taking advantage of the fact that utility data, as an example, was being collected for other purposes, cost management and estimates of budgets and things like that. But if you return to some of the comments that Caroline made about that data stream alone, the utility data for each of the buildings at each of our locations, it seems like a fairly routine data project. Oh, we're just going to collect utility data and we'll understand how much power is used in each building and then be able to come up with derivative estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from that. But as you begin to lay that out, its complexity starts to emerge quite quickly. So we have all these buildings, tens of thousands of them, a couple hundred locations. As Caroline mentioned, the monthly utility bills, which are kind of the source data, can often be different in each location. The utility company handles those things differently. Sometimes the bills are paper, sometimes they're digital, the languages are different. Maybe the units of power that are reported are different across those statements. Are they regularly delivered? Are they consistently delivered? All sorts of things that begin to ripple through this data supply chain, if you will, to have this sort of regular arrival of data that you can use for these sort of sustainability challenges. And so one of the major needs here is, how do you sort of synchronize all of this? And so for us, it was, and many other large organizations, it's what is the data platform that you might be able to stand up to collect and archive and importantly report out the state of the data. It could be the original data. Again, in this example, it could be, here's how much power your embassy is using over the past year or past 5 years. Are there trends? Are there patterns? Reporting is a critical feature. as is the ability to, in this case, use the data for a secondary purpose, the estimation of emissions. And so the good news is this platform is one that's widely available. It's called Energy Cap, and it has these kinds of features. And so it's been really helpful in sort of standardizing the approach across the State Department in terms of how's the data input, how is it received, how is it processed, how is it managed, how is it stored. And once it's in the system, then you can begin to use the data in this more integrated approach, come up with these secondary estimates and purposes. Having said all that, in terms of challenges, there is one that's central to all of this. The platform is centralized, but the addition of the data into the system requires a trained person at each location. It's a fairly automated thing, but nevertheless, training is required. And not a shock, training is just simply a never-ending pursuit. It's one of those critical things that underpins quality data is how ready are your staff to engage in sort of data processes.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about those projects. They're obviously very impactful and necessary for creating sustainable and useful data exchange. And this kind of leads nicely into the next question. Obviously, it was good to hear that many countries share climate goals and are kind of aligned in the interest to use and exchange data, but you also just started to discuss some of the obstacles to using this data. For example, the frequency of utility bills and unifying data that exists in different metrics. So I wondered what other obstacles exist to collecting, sharing, or exchanging certain environmental data, and what efforts exist to address those obstacles?
That platform thing is huge. When we wanted to share with Canada our climate risk data, it's the question of how do we do it? We struggle to share data across government agencies within the US government because we all use different things, whether it's Google or Microsoft or our own internal intranet. And so that is a huge barrier that requires investment in solutions. So the US government, we would need some common solution that allows us to monitor access and give access easily without another login. And so, for us, we're really thinking about single sign-on and identity management when it comes to data so that we can do a better job of sharing it. So that platform thing, I think, is probably one of the biggest. Another obstacle is just explaining why. Why do we have this data and how did it come to be? So with the air quality monitoring program, when we first started it in 2015, there were a lot of conversations with other governments who thought that we were kind of being big brother with this data, that we were making up this data. How did we get this data? Why are we using this monitor? And so that was a huge communications effort to meet individually, to provide public data, to show that everything that we are doing is based on open source information. So I could point to the EPA maintenance manual and say, this is exactly how we are maintaining this monitor. And this is exactly how we are publishing this data. And you can have every bit of data you want. You can have the raw data, you can have the data in an air quality index that the EPA use. You can have it however you'd like. And that went a long way into easing fears and overcoming obstacles of, what are you guys doing? That conversation globally has changed a lot in the last 8 years, where now governments are actively requesting us to put in monitors. They want that information. So I think the amount of communication that is required for any data effort cannot be underestimated. It's always twice as much, 3 times as much as you think it would be. And then on the another project that comes to mind is in DC. We put together an off-site solar farm for embassies. And this was a project that aligned very nicely with the Paris Agreement goal, because on-site solar is not going to be enough to meet decarbonization goals. We need to do offsite as well. And so the embassies in Washington, D.C. often don't have a ton of roof space. Some of them are big, but a lot of them are small. And we thought if we banded all of our demand together, we could approach a developer and actually get a pretty attractively priced solar installation. And this was something that was part of the US diplomatic goals at the time, is leveraging private financing to increase clean energy. When I went around to the embassies in DC, the concept of signing a long-term energy agreement for solar was very nascent, and people were very concerned, and why would I do this? And so that was a communications effort, showing the data. You can save money over the long term. You can avoid volatile energy price markets by signing a long-term agreement. And so that took probably 2 years longer than I thought it would, but we have it. It's now installed in Maryland. So I think that communications is probably the most important after the platform.
And for me, I would just offer connection back to my previous comment. This is probably coming a bit out of my sort of dual hats of senior sustainability advisor with the State Department and an academic. For me, the key obstacle in so much of this is training, right? Are your staff ready to engage? And in particular, for these sort of database decisions, I think the best ones are designed, right? And that they're designed with data in mind. And if that's done well, that usually carries with it a serious attention and resources around the professional development of staff to be ready for those kinds of initiatives. Now, the good news is the State Department has some really great training series around data. The State Department almost has a university of its own, where they offer just some amazing professional development courses on a wide variety of topics. And one series is around data. There's another emerging series around climate. And I think collectively that helps sort of prepare the next generation of leaders within the department to be able to focus on these sorts of things. Right? That awareness and competency is really critical. It kind of drives this flywheel around trying to solve these kind of grand environmental problems. I think what we probably all quickly appreciate is, things are more likely to happen if you understand why it should happen. And at the heart of that is training and education.
Well, thank you for those perspectives. And one thing that I found really interesting from your responses is that data can be used to facilitate trust. But trust is also one of the challenges to using data and collecting data. And so actually we're going to shift a bit and we're going to kind of return to a few things you mentioned earlier. One thing you mentioned was that some cities might be at greater risk for, climate change. And you mentioned flooding, and you also mentioned sea level risings. So what type of work do your teams or do in your day-to-day to support communities or populations that might be at a greater risk for environmental or climate crisis?
Because we are often a large presence in a city, an embassy is typically a large building. It doesn't always have to be, but it is a visible presence. We very much want to be a good neighbor. And so that could look like a lot of different things. It could mean that we, as simple as participate in a community garden, or it could mean that we are purchasing an EV an electric vehicle so that we are reducing our contribution to air pollution. So those types of efforts are something that we're constantly looking at. We have over 120 green teams around the world, and they are voluntary groups of employees that are actively looking at how do I reduce the footprint of diplomacy. So that's key. But I think the most important thing is that trust angle. I think I like how you put that we share data, we share how we got it, we share why we have it, and let them understand that. And then, ask them, what can we do to support?
For this, I will offer some thoughts around, probably a department inward kind of perspective here. The department itself is in many ways a global community, but again, each location has these unique challenges. There is my observation for the State Department, and it's kind of prime initiative around security, that first and foremost are the employees of the department safe, right? And there's a connection between that and the kinds of realignment or readjustment, if you will, of the risk, the safety and security risk that are driven by these external forces in the environment. As climate changes, security risk profile will change. And so one of my favorite projects at State Department that I was more an outside observer, but certainly a fan, is this hazards dashboard work that one of our groups is focused on. And it looks at our facilities and our locations around the world and tries to assess risk. And many of those are from these sort of environmental or climate forcings, whether it be sea level rise risk, or flooding from storm intensity shifts, and things like that. And I think that's one way to, again, try to inform this process of understanding, investment, and then sharing out with our partners. Here's what we're understanding. Here's what we're doing. As a result, welcome to help where we can. The sort of sharing outward of solutions is kind of this important function of diplomacy at the local level, is to share and share good practice.
Well, thank you for those insights. I think in the interest of time, I know that you said you had a colleague joining you, and maybe I'll leave you some time as well to offer any closing comments, but I'll just ask one more question, and then we can kind of transition to the open Q&A. But what do you see as the most pressing sustainability and climate challenges for the future? And what is being done today to better prepare future generations to address those challenges?
I think finance is probably one of the greatest challenges, because when we look at existing buildings and existing infrastructure, we need to amend those. We need to electrify infrastructure and buildings. We need to drastically improve our public transit and walkability. Again, I think these problems are solvable, but it just, can we get the financing mechanisms and models in place to do the investment at the scale and pace needed? So I think that is key. And then I would also throw commercialization of new technology in there, and that kind of relates to financing too. How can we get these really exciting climate tech and sustainability tech solutions that Kurt and other engineering universities and national labs see, and how can we get them out to commercialization as fast as possible? Those would be my two, and I think they're the solution really rely on mobilization. And there are a lot of banks, including the Silicon Valley Bank, that have been really investing in this space. And we need to think about other interesting model to do so. How can we capture cost? How can we do cost recovery in an interesting way? And so there are a lot of great people thinking about this challenge. There are a lot of new models. And I think for future generation, investing your time into thinking about this would definitely be helpful.
I'll add two things quickly. So I'd circle back to, all those things that Caroline mentioned. They're going to happen when people understand the threat and the challenge, and ultimately then the opportunity, right, to do something about it. People tend to act on what they understand. And so I think the sort of two-prong challenge is, I go back to climate literacy across the populace, across the public. So we're witnessing this unfolding challenge to our planet. It's a shared commons. And I think part of that is happening is because these problems are finally of such a scale in size and in time that they don't match well to our lived experience as a person. And we tend to think about our lifespan and kind of approximate location to where we're at. These are global challenges that are happening over decades, even if that speed is kind of accelerating. So I think that, it's clear that environmental data has to be part of these solutions, right? It is a core requirement for making progress. I think the second part of my comment, though, is that the data has to be used in ways that are effective. That communication is critical to these sort of data-driven stories that are being shared, as are who is the messenger in those stories. But the root is education. How do we do better with this? Because time really is pressing, and education is often the slow game.
Well, thank you for those insights. The monetary aspect is probably a really huge challenge, but so is the education. And Kurt, I think one of your last comments, how do you get people to understand that what they're doing in their daily life is actually affecting something on a much larger scale, or is contributing to a problem on a much larger scale? So if one person, throws away a glass jar, like they say that's not really a big problem, but then you have this compounding issue of, the entire world is doing the same thing. So thank you so much for your insights. And I can either, pass it over to you. I know you said you had a colleague joining you. I didn't know if you wanted to kind of offer some final comments about the State Department, or if you'd like to open it up to Q&A.
Let's open it up to Q&A. And first I'll just mention, the AAAS fellowship is a great way for junior level people who have completed their PhD who want to join the State Department and USAID. And so if you are interested in that, Calvin Arter's on the line, and I'm sure you can message him and he'd be happy to chat with you about it. And then the Jefferson Science Fellow program is for tenured professors. And that's another way. There's also a couple of other fellowships, a physics fellowship, and then there's the Presidential Management Fellowship, which has a STEM component, which I'm sure all of you would be qualified for. And, I think anytime we can bring in the wonderful world of science into diplomacy is a good thing. So I would definitely encourage you to look at those fellowships, consider joining State Department, look into the Foreign Service, and if that's something of interest. We would love to get more people with STEM knowledge into diplomacy.
I agree completely with all that. I will add, one thing that I was really fortunate to have a lot of great colleagues and sometimes unexpected connections with people all over the world through my time at the State Department. And I was just going to offer that for those of you who aren't in the States or aren't American citizens, some of those programs that were mentioned are restricted to citizens. There are similar programs in other countries. I had the opportunity to work with a number of fellows that I don't remember the specific names, but a number of certainly European nations seem to have programs a bit similar to AAAS or the JSF, Jefferson Science Fellow programs. Again, they have different names, so I'm sorry I can't be more helpful there. But I think there is a widespread understanding of the importance of bringing technically trained people into the diplomatic arena. So just do a little search if this area, which I'm guessing has some interest to you if you're on this in this meeting, just do a little search. You might find something relevant to your location.
I can go ahead and address some of the questions in the chat unless anyone wants to unmute and ask the questions themselves. We had one question here. Can you share a bit more about the current state of climate crisis data?
Climate crisis data?
It says, can you please share some climate crisis data? Where are we standing currently? So maybe they're asking more like, what's the current landscape and how fast are we potentially approaching climate crisis?
Well, I think that's the big billion-dollar question of how fast are we going to see some of these impacts? Certainly, there's this term 100-year flood, where a flood event is expected to happen once in 100 years. So somewhat unlikely, but with climate change, we're seeing it 6 times in 100 years or 15 times in 100 years. And with projections and forecasting, some of the climate risks that we thought would take longer to show up are happening sooner than we expected. So there's definitely not a moment to waste. I think in terms of using data, again, the thing is, where do we prioritize? And so, that can look a lot of different ways. So Manila is subject to flooding. If our embassy was on a hill, maybe we wouldn't prioritize doing some different infrastructure there. But it's not, so we're going to prioritize that. So there's the combination of what's going to happen in that city, and then how prepared is that city for what's going to happen to it. And so it's not just a global issue. It really gets down to this granular level where we need to be working with USGS and other entities like it on specific things like sea level rise. Is it going to go 5 feet or 7 feet? Because that's a big difference to a city.
I would just say, certainly there's a conundrum here, and that's a point I alluded to earlier about the sort of lived experience. It's really important to be able to communicate, say, the temperature trends in a city, say in Manila. That is where people spend their lives, and their point of reference is usually there. However, in terms of your question, the kinds of data that I think I find particularly most concerning and of interest are these sort of integrated signals that the planet is sending us if we're smart enough to observe them. And for me, I think the best one is our observations around ice pack, particularly around the Antarctic. And we're getting better and better at exploring that from above and below. And the signs are not encouraging. The ice pack there is disappearing more quickly than we first guessed, and is going to have global imperative and impact. That will be evident. Unfortunately, I think in ways or in timing that we can't fully predict. There's a lot of the population living along coastline, and there will be a substantial price to pay for that, both financial and otherwise.
And Anastasia, you had a question. Did you want to go ahead and ask that? And I know we're running short on time, so go ahead and pop off when you need to, but we'll try to conclude after this last question.
Yeah, thank you. One of the comments made by Kirk was interesting, describing data as its own supply chain and kind of the really complex effort that goes into collecting data, especially what sounds like IoT devices. So I wanted to ask, how do you navigate that gray area between pilot and production when you're ramping up, ramping down? Where do you see data ramping up or even ramping down? And how do you phase out of those different scenarios?
It's a great question. I also like that supply chain of data. I'm going to steal that, Kurt. I am trying to ramp down manual data collection as much as possible. So 10 years ago, we started an annual sustainability survey, and that goes out to all of our embassies and consulates, and we ask questions where we cannot get that data elsewhere. And now what we're thinking about is, now that we have IoT devices, now that we have other data sets, how do we change that survey to be focused on the things that we can't collect elsewhere that will really drive action? So that's one. I'm really trying to get rid of manual data collection as much as possible. I think the other kind of interesting thing with IoT is that you can get any data you want. I mean, given enough resources. Will you use that data to make decisions? And so this is something that Kurt has been really thinking about for the climate emission. How will we use this data? And so that, I think, is, you've got the first issue of how to get the data, how to make it interoperable, how to analyze it, but then really, how do you make it salient in business decisions is something that's really, really difficult. And so the one thing I want to leave you with is, State Department is focused on data heavily, more so than the 10 years that I've been here. We finally have an enterprise data strategy. We are really leaning heavily on data to drive diplomatic gains, and then data to improve and optimize our operations. We have a long way to go. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to people like you and get your ideas and start this two-way conversation. But it really is the future of diplomacy to be more data-driven. Diplomacy is an art, not a science. However, science can inform that art and be part of that art. So, we're really excited about that.
Well said. I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you both for being with us today. You've offered some really insightful commentary, and we'll potentially, I'll connect with Calvin for another conversation about the AAAS. But thank you so much, and we will keep you in mind for future events.
We love it. Yeah,
Thank you.
science and policy and diplomacy. It's a great marriage of topics. So thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, keep going.
All right. Thank you. Bye.